You're listening to How to Win Friends and Save the Republic, a podcast from the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. I'm your host, Andy Moore. My guest this week is Jeff Clements. Jeff graduated from Colby College in Waterville, Maine, and later from Cornell Law School in New York. He served as Assistant Attorney General of Massachusetts, where he worked on investigations and enforcement of deceptive trade practices, antitrust, and consumer protection laws. He later served as the chief of the state's Public Protection Bureau. Several years later, as a private attorney, Jeff was involved in the Citizens United case before the U.S. Supreme Court, in which he represented several public interest organizations and submitted an amicus brief on their behalf. Shortly after the disappointing and damaging Citizens United ruling was handed down, Jeff and some colleagues began to create a grassroots movement to overturn the ruling by passing the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution. That initial effort has continued to grow, and in 2016, Jeff helped found American Promise to accelerate the movement. Welcome to the program, Jeff Clements.
Thank you, Andy. Really glad to be here.
Also joining us today are some of Jeff's colleagues from American Promise, Deputy Political Director Alan LaPolice. Welcome, Alan.
It's a pleasure.
And Vice President of Outreach, Dr. Jessica Hare. Welcome, Dr. Jessica.
Thank you, Andy, for having me.
We're so excited to have you guys here. American Promise has been a member of NANR, I think, for several years, and is, I think, one of the more interesting and to me, this is personally Andy speaking, compelling organizations and structural changes that people are working towards. And so, as we get into the conversation about where we are today, I want to start back at the beginning. Jeff, and I'm going to start with you because I'd like our audiences to get to know you a little bit better. Now, I know that you majored in government and in college and went on to law school and a career in public service. Did you always know that you wanted to go into public service? Where did that desire originate for you?
Well, Andy, you're taking me back a long way. But when I went to law school, I did so because I did have a deep interest in public service. I had, worked for an environmental organization. I'd worked in a law firm. I'd gotten to know just after college for a year or two, what I had suspected as a student and as a young man at the time, trying to find my way in life, both in professional life and in personal life, and as a citizen. And I really did believe, and still believe to this day, now 30 plus years later, that we have a role to play, and I felt like it's partly a calling. It's partly because you believe in something. It's partly because you want to, you have views about what's a better way to go for the country and your family and your community and I had, now this may have turned out to be wrong, but I don't think so after I've had my ups and downs in this view, but I came to believe that the law was the highest way to have a lot of impact. And now, bear in mind, I know, cue the lawyer jokes if you must, Andy, but I had been immersed in lawyers who had done amazing things. And when I looked at American history, I saw lawyers like Thurgood Marshall do more than just about anyone had done in 100 years to actually defend the fundamental rights of Americans and make our country true to our beliefs, with the Brown versus Board of Education and many, many other decisions that, I learned about growing up, and I learned about in college, and I learned about because, they're landmark, rightly so. I saw lawyers react to the, destruction of the environment that has now led to literally having a global threat to humanity, in groups like Sierra Club actually have huge impact. So I thought, well, how can, if you care about American life, if you want an interesting way to have impact, it seemed like law school was a good way to go. And I still believe that. But there are many, many ways to practice law. And I didn't appreciate it at the time, but there are many, many ways that lawyers often, way too often, serve the most powerful interests. And it was lawyers, frankly, and judges that, in my view, deeply threaten the country with a view that the Constitution means people have, the very wealthiest people have a right to spend billions, no matter what the cost to the rest of Americans. And I think I felt bad as a lawyer and as a citizen that lawyers and judges had basically changed the Constitution with Citizens United and other cases that created this sort of kooky free speech right that corporations and billionaires have more rights than everybody else to have a voice in elections. And I started sort of, back where I began, kind of, ambivalent and questioning what is the role of law? What is the role of lawyers? And the beauty of America is that constitutional amendments are usually come to the rescue when the lawyers and judges screw it up. And that's where we are big time right now.
I will not make any disparaging comments about attorneys because I am perpetually considering law school, and my wife has made it very clear that no additional degrees shall be pursued until we pay for the previous ones, which I think is probably a good idea. Let's
happy to talk if you want about law school anytime.
Let's talk a little bit more about Citizens United in particular. I actually read through your amicus brief last night in preparation for the show today. And so the case was argued in 2009 and the decision came down in 2010. Can you give us a quick refresher on the primary question of that case and how you became involved?
Sure. So, the question in Citizens United and is an old question in American life. It goes back to the founders of the country. It goes back, it's a through line throughout our history, which is, how do we, the people, how do Americans, how does a constitutional democracy with a robust free enterprise system, as we should have, with a robust opportunity for anyone to start a business, to grow, to get rich. That's an opportunity that Americans can pursue if they choose, if they don't want to go to law school. I wouldn't go to law school if you want to get rich, but if you want to start a business and create something and invent, great. That's the American way of innovation, invention, and it's good, generally speaking, if we have a balance in democracy to ensure that freedom to succeed is there without the power to crush others. And that's what antitrust law is about. That's what our laws that protect our elections and our representative democracy, which is very different than the economy. So the question of Citizens United is, what is the role of money, in our elections? How much money can any one person or corporation, or frankly, big union spend to dominate the conversation and the outcome of elections? And it's an old question, because in the economy and that private life, we're all for go forth and do what you want to, make money or buy your Tesla or go to Mars, whatever turns you on. But when you come to be a citizen in the political space, you're just like everyone else. You have no more power than a teacher or a cop. You're just like everyone else, and you should be. That's what we love about this country. So in Citizens United, the court was dealing with the latest version of that old story, which is the laws that enable us to have limits on the power of money in our electoral system so that everyone has a voice, so everyone has representation. In this case, it was the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. This is a law that had been passed in 2002 in Congress, Republicans and Democrats. That's why it was the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. Senator John McCain on the Republican side, Senator Russ Feingold on the Democratic side. So sometimes it's known as McCain-Feingold law. But the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act said, you know what? Corporations have been prohibited from spending money to influence federal elections since 1912 or so, I believe it was. It was in the Teddy Roosevelt days. And you know what? Big unions, when they had huge power after the war in the middle of the century, 1948, the Taft-Hartley Act, there's a recognition that that concentrated money could corrupt as well. And the Taft-Hartley law was passed. So the idea that we regulate corporate and big money and individual donations, it was always with us. It was a standard notion of the First Amendment. But here, the lawyers I mentioned had come up with a sort of radical new theory, which is corporations and billionaires, big unions, anyone who has huge assets has a First Amendment free speech right to deploy that money as power to influence elections. And they said the law is unconstitutional. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, they said, violates the First Amendment right, the free speech right of the biggest corporations, the biggest powerful interest to spend unlimited money in elections, to influence elections. I didn't think so, and a lot of other people didn't think so. So that's what the Supreme Court is for. And in a catastrophic mistake, 5-4, the Supreme Court said that I'll just put it as the kooky theory of the First Amendment is the right one, according to the Supreme Court, which is we have no power as citizens to limit money in our political system because there's a new theory in town, and it's that the most global corporation, the richest billionaire, has unlimited power to spend that money and that's why we now, 10 years later, we see super PACs. We see literally $300 million donors. We see $500 million Senate races. We see the country torn apart with disinformation, division. It's not free speech and more information we're getting. It's terrible, propaganda driven by billions, literally billions of dollars that both parties are complicit in. And it's going to break the country. So that's what Citizens United did. How I came to it, I'm sorry, a long way around to your question, but how I came to it, Andy, was I had seen this kooky theory before. When we litigated against the tobacco companies, when I was at the Attorney General's office, we had a law in Massachusetts that said the cigarette companies who were using cartoons to addict children to a deadly substance. We had their internal documents. We'd done the investigation. They had done the analysis of what they called replacement smokers, new smokers to replace the ones they'd previously killed. And they had an analysis that said, if they start smoking at 13, 14, 15 years old, we'll have lifetime smokers. And they added up the economic benefit of billions of dollars. And I'd never forget the memo from inside the tobacco companies when somebody who probably had kids, who probably went to coach his little league team after a nice day at work. Here's what he did at work. He wrote a memo saying, I'd say this is a great bargain and investment for this company. And they decided to launch child targeting of marketing. And so in Massachusetts, others may remember the Joe Camel, the cartoon ads of smoking cigarettes, things like that. They were placing them around schoolyards, middle schools, playgrounds. And the people of Massachusetts said, that's insane. And we passed a law that said, you can't do that. Well, guess what? Tobacco company said, we have a free speech right to do that. Of course, we won. We litigated it. I did briefs in the district court in Boston. We won there. We went to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. We won there. But guess what? We lost in the Supreme Court, 5-4. The case is called Lorillard versus Riley. So I had seen this game plan before. It's how some of the big interests disable democracy by coming up with a fancy theory, calling it free speech, and disabling the power of the rest of us to protect our kids, to protect our families, and now to protect our elections. So I felt like I had to. I had left the Attorney General's office. I had an opportunity to file that brief in Citizens United, and so I did. And of course, it went the other way. I wasn't entirely surprised because I'd seen it coming, and it's gotten worse ever since. That's why we started this campaign of the constitutional amendment, because this only ends in a terribly dark place if we don't win this constitutional amendment, because the court is going down a very dangerous road.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back after a word from some of our sponsors.
This podcast is brought to you by IVN.us, an open news platform for independent-minded authors and readers. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe to IVN.us where you listen to podcasts. On SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher, Acast, or iHeartRadio.
Hey, Unrig It listeners. I'm Emily Corsetti from The Purple Principle. How did our country get so polarized?
The rise of television news, the rise of social media, every single force is pushing us apart.
How do we get less partisan?
People have a lot more in common than they think they do on policy.
And can independent-minded Americans bridge the divide?
I think that there's value to having folks like me outside of the parties.
Take a 360-degree tour of partisanship with The Purple Principle, wherever you listen to podcasts.
All right, and now back to the show. Alan, I want to go to you and talk a little bit about what the 28th Amendment is, right? I think a lot of people may have heard about it in association with American Promise, but can you tell us a little bit about what it is that you guys are actually fighting for?
So in shortest terms, the 28th Amendment simply restores to the states and the federal legislature the ability that they once had, and that is the ability to set reasonable regulations on spending. Who gets to spend, how much they spend, how do they report that spending? We're not trying to advocate for what those terms are. We're not trying to set any kind of limits. We're not the ones saying how it's got to be enacted. We're simply saying, let's go back just a few short years ago, just a decade ago, when state legislatures could set reasonable regulations and the federal legislature could set a reasonable limit and require transparency in elections. It used to be, the joke was that a lobbyist couldn't buy a member of Congress a cup of coffee without documenting how much that coffee cost and what discussion you had over that cup of coffee. And now the joke is you can buy them a coffee plantation and it's completely fine. You can literally buy them anything that you want. You can hand them suitcases of money. And I joke about this, but I mean, you can do this. You can give them, if they have a joint campaign committee, you can just put endless amounts of money. A billionaire can phone all their friends and they can all put money in there. And it used to be that, United States senators would say, well, you think that I'm so easily bought? Well, maybe you weren't 20 years ago when those reasonable limits were there. But now, I mean, you've got to raise $500 million for your race. Yeah, I think you might be bought if you're spending 70 to 80% of your time raising money and trying to get the vast war chest that you need to either win an election or stay in office. So the 28th Amendment simply says, we the people have a sovereign right to vote for and be heard in the election process. 28th Amendment says, give it back.
I wonder how much of it also is like not really an in-group bias, right? But if you are, a member of Congress or the Senate, and you, even from a small state, right? You're in Kansas, I'm in Oklahoma, someone like from one of our middle of the country states, they think, hey, my race is only $4 million or $10 million. It's not like one of these coastal elites that spends $500 million. But when the scale has gotten so far out of proportion, right, and it's ballooning everywhere, then even if it's not the $500 million race, even the little ones still add up to hundreds of millions of dollars, right?
They do. And I have a unique perspective because I ran for office. I ran 3 times. And the first time it was a unique race because the incumbent was disliked in the Beltway. The Speaker of the House really didn't like the incumbent who represented my district. And so the Speaker of the House got involved in my race, and they were giving me this advice: stop going to debates, stop doing town halls, stop talking to the average voter, because you need to be dialing for dollars at every given moment of every given day. Get yourself a comfortable headset and just bury yourself in these dialing for dollars calls. Now, I got an analogy here. I talked to an old Korean War veteran in my hometown. And I spent about 45 minutes. I was supposed to run to the store and buy a loaf of bread, but instead I stopped by his house and we talked about, the things that he advocated for, the things that I believed in. 45 minutes later, he believes in me. He's given me all of his expectations for defending the VA and his benefits. He hands me a check for $20 check, and it was heartfelt, and I was overwhelmed by his giving of it. The next day, I traveled down to Southwest Kansas, and I had about a 40-minute conversation, so less time, with an oil billionaire. And by the end of that conversation, same length of time, he was able to cut what they call a max check. His wife cut a max check. His kids cut max checks. But more importantly, over the course of the next few weeks, without my permission, he opened up what's called an independent expenditure committee. And they ended up spending $333,000 on the race against the incumbent. So that was a 40-minute conversation that garnered, close to $400,000 versus a 45-minute conversation with a real voter got me $20. I did the math. If I were to gain the kind of money that I would need to win, let's say even just a $1 million race, I would have had to spend 40 years talking to that vet or people like him just to get to the amount that I got from talking to that one oil billionaire.
So how would the 28th Amendment make that situation different? Like, what would that have changed for you if it had been in place?
So the speaker said the only thing that really matters is the money, how much you can raise. Early money is like East, they said. It's the only metric that they look at is your fundraising, because you got to pay for all of the campaign stuff. But it's not even the money that you get, it's the money that other people can spend on your behalf. If, let's say, Kansas wanted to set a regulation on that, they could. If they wanted to set transparency laws, they could. If the Congress were to give the Federal Election Commission the teeth to say, no, these are real limits, and we need disclosure on who's spending in what races, advocating for which candidates. If they could do that, then that means that that's not the only metric that wins the election. Message could go back to winning elections. Back in the day, it was message. I got to talk to Senator Bob Dole many times, and it was, for him, it was always message. That was what won races. It was, belly to belly conversations with voters in Kansas. That's what won him the House and then the Senate, and pushed him towards the presidency. He said he wouldn't even get into a race now because he couldn't in a million years raise the kind of money he would need to even win his primary election.
I had a conversation with a local school board member the other day who said, he spent a couple $1,000s of his own money when he ran a few years ago, but he drew an opponent last time that brought in outside money, and he said for a simple school board race, this guy was bringing in tens of thousands of dollars, and from outside organizations, and they were doing all the things you do in a campaign, and he didn't have a lot of experience. It just blew his mind that kind of money would come into for a tiny school board race. That he was like, we're not voting on laws, this doesn't have any national consequences. He was just shocked that people were willing to do that.
Yeah, Andy, I just wanted to jump in with a bit of a legal answer too to the question on how would Alan gave the answer about, what does it mean for real people? Well, what it means is you'll actually have conversations after the 28th Amendment with constituents and people who live there, and the issues that matter to everyone in that district or to the country will be the ones that matter, not the issues that matter to the billionaire. But for the legal wonks out there who want to kind of, dive into the mechanics of how this would work, it's very simple. What the oil billionaire did in Allen's race was illegal, and it should be illegal, because what he's doing is stealing from that Korean vet's rights. He's stealing what belongs to everybody, and that's a voice and a fair shot at actually being a citizen in a representative democracy. So after the amendment, Congress could pass again the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, making it illegal to run a super PAC and put $330,000 into it. And the reason it would be illegal if Congress or Kansas chose to enact those laws is because right now the Supreme Court says, well, you can't do that because it's free speech. After the amendment, free speech still matters a lot, but so does freedom and equal rights of all Americans. And so it's like every free speech issue. It's a balance. That Korean vet, the Korean War vet, that American who served his country and Alan talked with, he has a free speech right too. And that's what the Constitution's all about. You balance our rights against each other's, and there's no billionaire right to do that. So if after the amendment, Congress passes the law because the people want it, and I guarantee you the people want it, you try to run that kind of money into a campaign, you're committing a crime.
Can I also add one more thing too quickly? Our government, it gets its right to govern by the consent of the governed, by the people. And right now we've done polling, and everybody's going to admit this, at face value, they don't trust that the political system is fair because there's literally billions and billions of dollars being spent. They see all the negative campaign ads. They know how much those commercials cost. They know that every election is bought and paid for. And so the main thing that we are lacking, that we once had back in the 60s, there was a 77% trust in government. 77% of the people trusted that the government would do the right thing most of the time. And now that's below 20, and it's been as low as 11, 12%. So the consent of the governed is not granted when we don't trust that the process is fair. We all still hopefully believe that democracy still works. We all still believe that good people will run, good messages can win. But right now, people just think it's only about the money. If we pass the 20th Amendment, and it's not only about the money, hopefully, that consent will return, and that trust, which is vital, that trust in government and in the institutions will return. And that's what America needs right now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Jessica, I want to talk to you about how this happens, like how you, as an organization, even start to build out a strategy to pass this kind of massive overhaul that needs to happen in our country. A lot of our members at NANR are working on, state-based, like state constitutional amendments or maybe changes to municipal charters. But something like this is an enormous undertaking. Where do you start? How do you begin to engage with the public and help get them on board with this?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So my background is in social work. I am a social worker. And, social workers, we bring a very different, unique and valuable perspective to things that relate to the everyday population. We give our time, we give our money, and, we just bring a different set of unique knowledge and skills. And I wholeheartedly believe that, we have our National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics. And one of the things that we value ourselves on is valuing the dignity and worth of a person. So you really have to build a rapport with people, and you really have to engage in conversation with them to find out what they are passionate about. And in order for them to, gain that sense of trust to believe that, we can make change and believe that their voices matter. Social workers, we also, look to write policies and implement those policies, and helping people understand who to vote for, which congressman or congresswoman or which senator to really vote for, to put in put into the seats to be able to advocate for the issue that is most important to you. So it all starts with a conversation and listening to understand versus listening to respond. And understanding, again, what that person is passionate about. Like, we have domestic violence issues in rural communities where, they have so many resources in an urban community, but they have nothing in a rural community. No money is going, to those resources or, to those communities to even be able to help, our everyday American citizens in those areas. We have many veterans that are homeless. We have veterans who, sacrifice 20 plus years, sacrifice spending time with their families, sacrifice their lives just to come back and be homeless, living on the streets with no resources, no, type of education for them, nothing to help them live a whole life. So, again, for me, it all just goes back to building that rapport, finding out what people are really passionate about, what issues are relevant to them, what issues they really see as being an issue in America, and how do they educate themselves on finding out, who to talk to that, about those issues that resonate most with them.
Well, you're speaking my language now. My wife is a social worker, and I used to teach at the OU College of Social Work here in Oklahoma as well. And I'm also a licensed therapist, so I believe all of this stuff you're saying. This is my argument too, right? If we were all just recognize the humanity in one another, we'd probably find a lot more in common than we would that divides us. Jessica, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned so far doing this work?
Mm-hmm. I would say one of the biggest lessons that I've learned for me as a social worker, because prior to American Promise, I was a McKinney-Vento school social worker, which I, helped with the homeless population in the schools. The biggest lesson that I learned for myself and what I can pass along to my social work colleagues is that we may look at things as a political, that, everything is, versus like it's a political standpoint. And, we don't necessarily want to get involved in politics or, just kind of shy away from it. But at the end of the day, if you put a different spin on it, advocacy is the word that's at the forefront of all of this, being an advocate for human needs, human rights, all of that. So, just being, I think the biggest takeaway is just educating yourself and, again, understanding how politics relates to social workers and social justice, social injustice, advocating for oppressed populations. All of it ties in together. And at the end of the day, you have to have funding, and we can't continue to pour in so much money like we did in the last election to campaigns and people that are just not right for our economy. We have to be able to, really take a stance and get our voices heard, because, you have people who actually understand the politics and they're in fields like social work, therapists, teachers, other fields, and they would be great, but because they don't have the funds, they don't really want to put themselves out there, because then nobody will hear their voices and no one will vote for them. But we have to continue to advocate for one another and just educate one another, and that's the biggest takeaway that I've gotten from this thus far.
Well, you guys have certainly convinced me on this. Jeff, I want to come back and end with you. This is obviously a big goal. Do you believe that you guys will be successful in passing this amendment, and what makes you so confident?
I absolutely believe we'll pass it. I don't think we have a choice. And, as Winston Churchill said, Americans always do the right thing after exhausting all the other possibilities. And we have rapidly exhausted the possibilities. The window is closing. I have to, just add some context to something you said, Andy, which is, the small states it's only the coastal states that are seeing multi-billion-dollar spending. And it's actually the idea of a $200 million Senate race or multi-$100 million Senate races, that's everywhere now. Let's take Maine. Just barely 1 million voters, $200 million Senate race in 2020. Maine didn't even crack the top 5. There will not be another Senate race under $200 million until this constitutional amendment is ratified. And I assure you, we are just at the beginning of this. It's destabilizing the country badly. So we have a choice. We pass the American Promise constitutional amendment and ratify it and unite Americans together to do it, or we become the most powerful oligarchy and plutocracy the world has ever seen. And it won't be much power for many good purposes or people at that point. But let me give you some more data points, because the amendment's happening. It's not like, this is so important we have to do it, but gee, if only somebody had a plan, if only there was some way for Americans to do this. Well, guess what? Sign up at americanpromise.net, sign the Citizen Pledge, and you'll join millions of people. 22 states have formally passed resolutions telling Congress, get off your butts, stop fighting with each other, and pass this constitutional amendment. And 6 of those states were ballot initiatives where the citizens had a voice. We've never lost one. We're 6 for 6. We're going to be on the main ballot in 2022. And I'm confident we'll go 7 for 7. And they're not just coastal. They're not just blue, so-called blue, which I don't buy. I've been all around the country, and I see American states, not blue or red. But, the Colorado, Montana, 75% yes for this amendment. Alaska passed it, as you know, Andy, with a lot of support of NANR members and a bunch of other related reforms, which this amendment goes along with, a real renewal of the country. We have massive support from business people. Most business people don't want to play this game. Maybe an oil billionaire does, but talk to any business person in your hometown. Ask them if they like it, how this is going. Ask them if they'd like a level playing field. Ask them if they'd rather not get the arm put on them by politicians trying to hit them up for donations. I guarantee you there'll be a long line outside your door of business people trying to say, where do I sign? for this amendment? The answer is AmericanPromise.net, by the way. That's where you sign. And so we're confident. It's introduced in the Senate. It's introduced in the House. It has 200 supporters in the House. It has 50 in the Senate. The hard part, of course, as in everything in America right now, is uniting the politician Republicans and the politician Democrats who still dominate in Congress and getting them to work together. I say the politicians because Americans who are Republicans, Americans who are independents, Americans who are Democrats actually support this across the board. 3 out of 4 Americans. So we just need to keep building this American Promise movement. We, the people, we need to fight for it. As Dr. Jessica said, you may not like politics, but you got to get in the game, because this isn't partisan politics. This is politics of America at its best. This is the kind of politics that has won 27 other amendments. We did 4 constitutional amendments between 1961 and 1971. That's in the lifetime of a lot of Americans, 4 in 10 years. So if you're saying, oh, gee, amendments are too hard, it's not going to happen, that's an excuse. So get in the game and try, and let's see what we can do together.
Just another example of how ripe America is for true reform to kind of get our democracy back on track. Jeff, thanks so much for being here today.
Andy, thank you. And thanks to all the work you do and all the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers out there.
Alan, thank you for being here as well.
Thank you, Andy. In case it was missed, AmericanPromise.net.
Dr. Jessica, thank you for being here as well.
Thank you for having us.
My guests today were from American Promise, President Jeff Clements, Deputy Political Director Alan LaPolice, and Vice President of Outreach, Dr. Jessica Hare. Thanks for listening to How to Win Friends and Save the Republic. This podcast is a program of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. For more information about our organization and how you can join, please visit our website at nonpartisanreformers.org.